From the halls of Montezuma, Kansas, that is, to wherever you may be, this is the Sure and Secure Podcast, a ministry of Morningside Community Church, helping you become sure that Christianity is true and that your salvation is secure through Jesus Christ. I'm Pastor Tim Erickson. Thanks for listening today. Your favorite football team is down by 20 points in the fourth quarter when your starting quarterback goes out of the game with an injury. Even so, the backup comes in and leads your team to a glorious comeback to win the game. It's a miracle, you think. Well, no, not really. Or how about this? You're heading to Walmart on a rainy day, and just as you pull into the parking lot, the spot closest to the front door comes open just in time for you to park there so you don't have to walk so far through the rain. It's a miracle, right? Well, no, not exactly. Well, even if those events aren't miracles, don't fear, friends. Miracles are possible. That's what we'll talk about on this episode of the podcast as we continue to talk through the book 12 Points That Show Christianity is True by Dr. Norman Geisler. This book presents a comprehensive case for the truthfulness of the Christian faith, beginning with an observation that literally everyone has to agree with, and then moving little by little, step by step, to defend the core truths and claims of the Christian faith in order to show that the entire Christian faith is true and correct. We've been talking about this framework for a few weeks now on the podcast. Let's review what the previous points are before we talk about point number 4 today. Point number 1 was this: truth about reality is knowable. And as we saw in our discussion of that point, that observation is literally undeniable. No one can actually deny that truth about reality is knowable. Each and every one of us knows at least this one thing: I exist. And no one can deny that they exist because they would have to exist in order to deny that they exist. Now, again, that might seem like a strange place to start a case for Christianity, but remember, the power of the observation is that everyone has to agree with it. So this is intellectual common ground for all of humanity. Point number 2 was this: opposites cannot both be true. We talked about and learned about the law of non-contradiction, that a claim about the world cannot be both true and false at the same time and in the same sense. The power of this point is that as we start to learn things that are true about reality, we can commit ourselves to those truths, knowing that anything that contradicts them has to be false. So when we land on truth, we know we are standing on solid ground, and we can build our lives from that, build our understanding of reality from that. Point number 3 got to one of the essential claims of the Christian faith, and it was this: it is true that the theistic God exists. Now remember, when we're talking about the theistic God, we're talking about the traits of God as the creator of all things, the one who created everything and who sustains everything. And through his creative act, he has shown us that he is eternal, that he exists necessarily. He has shown us that he is powerful and intelligent and wise and good. So that's the kind of picture of God that we are focusing on when we talk about the theistic God. It's a picture of God that we certainly find in the pages of Scripture, but it's also a picture of God that we can come to understand just by reasoning about the details of the world around us. And since we know that the theistic God exists, that allows us to know the truth of point 4 in these 12 points. This is the point we'll talk about today, that miracles are possible. Since there is a God who created this universe, then there is a supernatural being who exists, a supernatural being behind this universe, or in other words, who is responsible for it. He created this universe, he sustains it and keeps it going, and since he exists, then it's possible for him to act in the world that he has created. And those acts of God are what we call miracles. Now, it is important that we understand exactly what a miracle is, because sometimes we use that word a little too casually and in a way that ultimately isn't, technically correct. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, sometimes we end up with the best parking spot in the entire parking lot, and we call it a miracle. Well, I suspect that we all know that's not truly a miracle. But if that's not really a miracle, then what is a miracle? I really appreciate the short and pithy definition that Dr. Geisler offers in this chapter of his book when he writes, "Miracles are an act of God to confirm the Word of God to the people of God." Now, we'll talk about the last two parts of that statement in the next episode of the podcast, but right now we'll focus on that first part, that a miracle is an act of God. A miracle is a truly supernatural event, an event that cannot be fully explained simply by pointing to natural forces or powers in this world. A miracle is an act of God. So for a few examples, just think about the plagues that God brought upon Egypt through his prophet and messenger Moses. Now, you might recall that the magicians of Egypt were able to duplicate or at least imitate a couple of the signs that Moses performed by the power of God. Probably they did that through a connection to demonic powers, which would also be supernatural. But remember that when Moses, by the power of God, created living beings out of dust, the magicians looked at that and exclaimed, "This is the finger of God." They knew that they had just witnessed something that only God could do, and that they were not going to be able to imitate or duplicate that act. They saw it, they recognized it as an act that only God can do. But think of another one of those plagues, the plague of the locusts coming upon the crops of Egypt. Now, there isn't necessarily anything supernatural about a swarm of locusts coming and devastating the crops in an area. That happens not regularly, perhaps, but it happens often enough that there are other historical records of that happening. But the supernatural element in that sign was the control over the locusts. Moses was able to tell Pharaoh that the locusts were going to come, and then they did. And then when Pharaoh asked that they be sent away, Moses, by the power of God, was able to send them away. So the supernatural control in that instance is what makes that sign a miracle. Also, Dr. Geisler notes in this chapter that immediacy is often a sign of a miracle. For example, doctors can help sick patients recover and rehabilitate from a number of different ailments, but when Jesus or his disciples healed a sick person of an ailment, for example, they did so immediately, instantly, and in most cases without the use of any sort of therapeutic means like medicines or anything like that. They simply spoke the word and it happened. So events like that can properly be called a miracle. And as we try to make a comprehensive case for the truthfulness of Christianity, we have to deal with this question of whether miracles are even possible, whether they can happen. That's a question that, or a claim of Christianity that is often denied these days, especially because of the scientific age in which we live. This age in which some people have perhaps a really overgrown confidence that science will eventually be able to explain every last thing that happens or has happened or ever will happen on this earth. And some from that mindset then have said, well, miracles are impossible. Well, we'll talk in a few minutes about why they say that and how they try to make that case. But let me read you a couple paragraphs here from Dr. Geisler's chapter that zoom in and focus on the connection between God and miracles, and why it's so important to establish that God exists before we talk about the possibility of miracles. Because if God exists, then there's simply no way to rule out the possibility of miracles. Here's what he says, quote, "If God exists, then miracles are possible. Why? Because they are a supernatural act of God. And supernatural acts can exist only where there is a supernatural being who can so act. As C.S. Lewis aptly stated, if we admit God, must we admit miracles? Indeed, indeed, you have no security against it. That is the bargain. After all, if God created the world, then the biggest miracle has already occurred, making something from nothing. Other miracles in the Bible are making something from something. If God can make water from nothing, then he has no problem in making wine from water. Likewise, if God can make matter from nothing, then multiplying loaves is just making matter from matter." Unquote. So what Dr. Geisler is saying is that if God exists, and if he has created the universe, then anything else that he might do would be less difficult than what he has already done. He made water from nothing. And so it would be less difficult for him to then take that water and turn it into wine. Or if he made human life itself, then to restore sight to a human being who has lost it, it would be less difficult than what he has already done. So if God exists, then miracles are possible. Now, we do still need to defend that claim because it is sometimes denied by people who are skeptical of the Christian faith today, or people who are just skeptical of religion in general. Now, much of the modern skepticism about miracles can be traced back to the writings of Scottish philosopher David Hume, who lived and wrote during the 1700s. And here in this chapter, Dr. Geisler outlines two arguments against miracles that can be taken from the writings of David Hume. One argument that's directed against the possibility of miracles, and a second argument that is directed against the knowability of miracles. In other words, the first argument just tries to flat out prove that miracles are impossible. The second argument doesn't try to say that miracles are impossible. Rather, it just tries to make the point that no one should rationally believe that a miracle has happened because of the weight of evidence against it. So let's discuss these two arguments. First, that argument that miracles are simply impossible. The claim is that they just can't happen. And that argument is based on an appeal to the laws of nature. Essentially, this argument says that miracles cannot happen because they would be violating the laws of nature. That is still an argument that we hear used today against the possibility of miracles. People say that they can't happen because they would be violations of the laws of nature. Well, let's think about the laws of nature for a moment and make sure we understand what they really tell us and what they really are. The laws of nature tell us what will happen in typical circumstances as long as other factors don't intervene. So, for example, I know from the law of nature that if I toss a ball up in the air and then I move my hand out of the way, it will fall all the way to the ground. Now, the law of nature doesn't say that the ball must fall all the way to the ground. I mean, I could reach out my hand again and catch the ball before it makes it all the way to the ground. Or there might be something else in the way that I didn't see when I tossed the ball up in the air. Maybe it lands on a bag that was sitting on the ground, and so it doesn't make it all the way to the ground. The thing we have to understand is that the laws of nature don't tell us what can or cannot happen in the world. They don't tell us what is permitted or what is not permitted to happen in the world. They simply tell us, or they describe, we might say, what will happen in typical circumstances as long as other forces don't intervene. Now, when we say that a miracle has taken place, what we are saying is simply that another factor has intervened, namely the power of God has intervened in the normal course of affairs in order to accomplish something that is supernatural. And so when we understand correctly what the laws of nature are, we realize that a miracle doesn't actually violate the laws of nature. It doesn't break a law of nature. A miracle can actually be consistent with the laws of nature. Because again, a miracle has simply occurred because another factor has intervened to make the circumstances no longer typical circumstances, as they would have been if the power of God had not acted in that moment. So the laws of nature really do not rule out the very possibility of miracles taking place. But what about this second argument? This argument that wise, intelligent, rational people could never believe claims about miracles because the evidence could never be strong enough in order to prove that a miracle has occurred. Okay, so let me use an example here to explain this objection. Think about the resurrection of Christ. Now, the claim that we as Christians make is that Jesus came back to life by his own power. Now, the skeptic correctly points out that at no other time in human history has something like that happened. Okay? Now, for the moment, we'll just set aside instances like Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, which is different because Lazarus didn't come back to life under his own power, as Jesus did when he was resurrected. But anyway, the skeptic essentially makes the case that dead people stay dead. We do not see dead people coming back to life under their own power. The uniform experience of human history has been that when a person dies, he does not come back to life by his own power. And so the skeptic takes that observation and says, look at the weight of evidence that we have against resurrections. If we have all of this evidence against resurrections, then a wise, informed, rational person should believe that even Jesus continued to stay dead and that he really did not come back to life. Now, Dr. Geisler points out a crucial flaw in this argument that flows out of a premise that could be stated like this: the evidence for what regularly happens should always outweigh the evidence for what rarely happens. Now, if one believes that claim, it leads to the reality that that person could never believe that rare events have actually happened. That he could never believe that singular events, unrepeatable events, have actually happened, even though we know that such events have happened. For example, the creation of the universe was a singular event. It's only happened one time, and yet even scientists who make no appeal to God believe that the universe began to exist. And the beginning of the universe is a singular event, a rare event. And yet, are we supposed to say that we're not supposed to believe it happened because universes don't start to exist every single day? Well, of course not. That's ridiculous. We are living in this universe right now, this universe that had a beginning. And can we not believe that the beginning of the universe actually happened, even though it's a singular event? Well, of course we can believe it happened. Now think again about the resurrection of Christ, and hopefully I can make the flaw in this argument even a little more clear to you if it's not entirely clear already. Again, remember, the skeptical objection is that since everyone else in history has remained dead, no one else in history has come back to life by his own power, then we should not believe that Jesus came back to life under his own power. But what we actually have to account for with the resurrection of Jesus is not what may have happened to every other human being who has ever lived. But we have to account for what actually happened to Jesus. In other words, we can't write off the truthfulness of this particular claim about this particular instance just by appealing to the general pattern of what typically happens. And so the skeptic has to answer the specific evidence that exists around the death and resurrection of Christ. And he can't wiggle off of that hook simply by pointing to the general pattern for the rest of humanity. Because after all, by definition, a miracle is a rare event. A miracle doesn't happen in the normal course of events. Miracles don't happen under normal circumstances. They are, by definition, rare events. And if we cannot simply write off the very possibility of miracles, and we already saw that as we responded to the first argument, then we have to conclude that if a miracle can happen, then it must be believable to say that it did happen. A theory that allows for an event to actually happen and yet say that no rational person could believe it is a flawed theory. So if miracles are possible, then miracles are affirmable, and we can believe that miracles have actually happened if they have, in fact, taken place, if the evidence for them is good and true and accurate. So to sum things up for this episode, since God exists, miracles are possible. Miracles can happen. And if they can happen, then you and I are not fools for believing that they have happened in this world by the power of God. Now, as we continue to talk through these 12 points, we'll see a little further down the road why miracles are so important for confirming the truth of our faith. But we'll get into that in greater depth in future episodes. For this episode, let me simply thank you for listening and for giving me the opportunity to hopefully teach you something to the glory of God. If you've been blessed and instructed and encouraged by this podcast, I'd encourage you to let other people know about it so that we can pass the blessing along to others and help them to become sure and secure in their faith in Jesus Christ.